So, this lecture is Segregation, Is It History? The class is for the undergraduate class on the history of the U.S. since 1865. This lecture will take a special look into the history of segregation. It will also look into whether it potentially exists today, which some argue it does, others argue it does not. The first official policy was the Black Codes of 1865, in which people were told where they could work and live if they were black. The codes were in place during the Reconstruction of the country after the Civil War. Fines were in place for the homeless and unemployed. Unpaid fines resulted in prison, which resulted in unpaid work. Orphans of slavery were often taken in by their former owners. It is easy to argue these laws were designed to ensure there would be cheap labor available after slavery was officially ended. After Reconstruction, Black codes ended and Jim Crow replaced them. Jim Crow affected daily life. It controlled where someone could live and work. It controlled where someone could get their education. It controlled where someone could drink from a fountain. Segregation was very, very real and strictly enforced. I don't think in today's time there's anyone that would argue for segregation. However, there was a time when the majority believed that segregation was acceptable, as long as it was separate but equal. As early as 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of segregation. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson that segregation was acceptable and the only requirement was for the separate but equal. However, in reality, separate but equal was impossible. Black communities were underfunded. Even schools were underfunded. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against separate but equal, at least in education. In Brown v. Topeka Board of Education in 1954, segregation in school was outlawed. The reality was a different story. It was a challenge to get true equality. Students still face challenges when entering the previously all-white schools. It was a challenge to get students to schools outside of their communities. Besides fighting in court, people have fought against segregation in other means. For example, since its founding in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People has fought peacefully through protests and other means for the end of segregation. They were fighting for true equality. So segregation was enforced through laws such as the Jim Crow laws. However, it was also enforced through another means, through a ban on interracial marriages. Segregation was enforced by controlling who you could fall in love with and who you could not fall in love with. In 1967, the United States Supreme Court unanimously ruled in Loving v. Virginia that the ban on interracial marriages was unconstitutional. However, in reality, there were still bans on states' constitutions as late as 1998 and 2000. So even though the United States Supreme Court ruled against having bans, states still allowed the bans. Now, granted, nobody enforced these bans, but it says a lot to still have the bans on your constitution. It speaks very loudly. So in 2000, a poll was conducted by the University of South Alabama for the Mobile Register in 2000 regarding the removal of the ban on interracial marriage. The poll found that only 31% of the whites sampled approved of interracial marriage. Now, although only 31% approved of the interracial marriages, almost 2/3 were in favor of removing the ban from the state's constitution. It's just mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing. In 2000, there was still a ban, and there was still a third wanted to keep the ban. And it's interesting to note that South Carolina didn't remove their ban until 1998. Now, it is hard not to go into detail as to how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came to be, but this lecture is about segregation and whether segregation is still alive today. The fight for the civil rights is a long, hard road, and it's easy to argue that it's not over. But I promise we will discuss that throughout this class, and I hope that this lecture will get you inspired and ready to learn about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and everything that it took to get there. So, segregation is not legal anymore. There's no laws on the books stating where you can work or where you can't work. In fact, there's laws that prohibit segregation. However, what is happening in reality? For example, we can look at real estate practices. In the New York Times, there was a report about how, although Trump never technically declared he was guilty, it was found that there was racial bias in who was shown what homes, where. And it was argued that that's what all the real estate agents were doing. That's what all the real estate property managers were doing. It's just what it was. Now, is that segregation? How is it not segregation? I am from Springfield, Massachusetts. I lived there the majority of my life. It's where I went to school. It's where I was raised. It's where I raised my children. And when I went to school, we had school choice. And school choice allowed you to go to school within your city, but outside of your immediate community. And I couldn't find what year school choice was ended, but I know it was ended after I graduated, which was in 2000. And it was argued that when they ended school choice, it created segregation of schools. Now, they said the reason that school choice was ended was due to the cost of busing. Whatever the reason, the reality is in 2013, the University of Michigan research project found that Springfield is the most segregated city nationwide in terms of Hispanic and white separation. The University of Michigan also found that Springfield is home to 75% of the region's Black residents and more than 50% of the region's Hispanic residents. Those are pretty large numbers. It's hard to argue that segregation doesn't exist when 75% of the region's Black residents are living in Springfield, and 50% of the region's Hispanic residents are living in Springfield. And then when you factor in the communities are segregated, and then the schools are segregated through lack of school choice. It's just something to really look into, and more research is needed, but it's very interesting to think about. So one thing that I think is really important to get out of this lecture is the importance to look at the past and make sure to connect it to the present. To do research, to find out what's going on in your community, in your state, and in your country. Sometimes it's just too easy to not notice what's going on because we're busy. We're busy with school, we're busy with family, we're busy with work. We are always constantly busy. It's a struggle, but we have to find the time to figure out what's going on in our world. Because it impacts us, it impacts our future, it impacts the next generations. I know I wish I had a whole lot more time to present this lecture because it's meaningful and I want it to be purposeful and have an impact. But if there's anything you get out of this lecture, it is to do research, to find out more, to learn more, and hopefully if there's a need for it, a call to advocate for change. And that's a whole nother lecture on advocating for change. I'm Carrie Ting, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Have a great night.